Hello everyone, this is your friend from Naruto Audio Fanfics, and we are back once again with a brand new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto discovered the hidden child of Tsunade and Jiraiya? Part 1. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit the like button, thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing Naruto fanfics like this. So without wasting any more time, let's start today's fanfic. Tsunade walked briskly down the hallway of the Hokage Tower, blonde hair and light green jacket flowing behind her as she approached her office. She was running late this morning, and she knew that Shizune wasn't going to approve, but what did it matter to Tsunade? After all, she was 22 years Shizune's senior, and she wasn't about to back down from the younger woman now. I'm a grown-ass woman, and I'm not about to be put in my place by my apprentice. Tsunade muttered as she flung open the office doors. Tsunade-sama, you're running extremely late. Shizune chastised as Tsunade walked into the office. I know, Shizune. I'm late because of that errand that I needed to run today. You recall that I was talking about it this morning before I left, correct? Tsunade said as she sat at her desk and rubbed her temples. I do, Tsunade-sama, but, are you alright? Shizune asked as she walked over to her mentor. I'm fine, Shizune, I'm just tired. Tsunade muttered as she leaned back in her chair. Shizune looked down at her mentor with worried eyes. Usually Tsunade was never tired unless it was midday and she'd been drinking sake, but she usually fell asleep at her desk around that time. Shizune gently touched Tsunade's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze, bringing Tsunade out of her daze, bringing her gaze over to look over to Shizune's hand, and then up to Shizune's face, and the small smile that was present there. Tsunade returned her smile before reaching into her desk drawer, pulling out her stamp and pens. Okay, time to get started. Tsunade said as she prepared herself for a day-wasting stack of mission assignments, mission reports, and so on. Tsunade-sama, if you're not feeling up to it, why don't you just do the first half of the day's work, and I'll finish the rest? Shizune said as she looked down at Tsunade. If you insist. That'll give me some time to go over to the hospital and check in with Sakura to see how she's doing, and to check out some of the Anbu that had come in earlier this week. Tsunade replied as she looked over to Shizune, who was on her way back to the desk with the first stack of papers for Tsunade. If you need it done, I can go over now for you while you work on this first stack. Shizune said as she placed said stack on Tsunade's desk. If you could take care of the first rounds, go for it. I'll just sit here and work on these papers. But will you bring back some of the paperwork from the hospital so I can go over some of the intake work? Tsunade asked as she sifted through the files and papers, eyes never leaving the stack. Shizune quickly bowed to her mentor and walked over to the door and left for the hospital. Tsunade merely continued to do her work, working through the first stack, and grabbing a second stack from the small table off to her left. She had began to work through some of the assignments, steadily making headway through the paperwork. By the time she was halfway through the second stack, Shizune walked back through the twin doors. Sakura-san is doing fine, and so are all of the patients, but I did bring back the intake paperwork as you asked. Shizune said happily as she looked into Tsunade's amber eyes. That's great to hear, Shizune, thank you for checking on them for me. And I'm just about finished with the paperwork for the morning. Tsunade replied as she finished up another mission assignment. I can take over from here if you'd like, Tsunade-sama. You look like you can use some rest now. Shizune said as she walked over to the desk and stood next to Tsunade. No, I'll finish this last piece and then we can go, Tsunade mumbled just before she lost consciousness and fell forwards, face first, onto her desk. Tsunade-sama. Shizune screamed in horror as she shook the shoulders of her mentor. When Tsunade didn't respond, Shizune quickly called in a couple of medics to take her down to the hospital. Shizune and Sakura followed behind the medics as they were hauling Tsunade's unconscious body into an emergency room. Each exchanged a look of worry and concern for their mentor. They walked in and were soon hooking Tsunade up to a few machines to check her out. Pulse was normal, blood pressure was fine, brain waves were normal, and her height and weight were in check. Both apprentices were stunned, and couldn't figure out why their mentor had suddenly collapsed the way she had. Sakura thought for some time on this, and then came to the conclusion to check what no one else thought to check on Tsunade. She paused momentarily before her hands glowed a soft green color. Sakura gently placed her hands on Tsunade's abdomen, placing all of her concentration into her jutsu. She stood there for several minutes, concentrating on trying to find the source of Tsunade's collapse when her eyes suddenly bulged in shock. Kami, Sakura said as she took her hands away from Tsunade's stomach. What's wrong, Sakura? What did you find? Shizune asked as she looked at the pink-haired Kunoichi. Sakura looked over to Shizune, jaw dropped and eyes wide. She's PP pregnant. Sakura stuttered as she looked back over to her mentor. Pregnant? How? She always told me that she couldn't have children. Shizune asked as she looked between Sakura and Tsunade. We'll have to wait until she wakes up to ask, but it's apparent that she has lied to us about her reproductive system. Sakura answered as she stepped away from Tsunade's bedside. Another thing we can ask her is who the father is. Shizune said as she walked over towards the door of the room. I'd like to know that as well, Shizune-san. Sakura replied as she walked behind Shizune. The two medics left the sleeping Hokage alone in the room, making their way to their respective locations, Sakura swiftly walking around and doing her rounds, Shizune on her way back to the Hokage Tower to finish working on the documents that Tsunade was unable to finish before she blacked out. As she finished her rounds, Sakura walked into her office at the hospital. Being a full-time med-nin, and the apprentice of Tsunade, got her some small perks. She walked over to her desk and sat in her chair, putting away some last-minute files that she hadn't yet gotten the chance to file away. After the files were taken care of, her mind traced itself to her special blonde, and the one and only hyperactive ninja of Konoha, Uzumaki Naruto. They'd been dating for a little over a year now, and their relationship kept getting stronger by the day. Sure, she knew that Hinata had a huge crush on Naruto when they were younger, but she slowly fell for Gaara of the Sand, and they've been together for over 3 years now and still going strong. After Hinata had left to live in Suna with Gaara, Naruto had confessed his love for Sakura, again, and she finally realized that she felt the same way. They shared their first kiss at the top of the Hokage mountain just above the 4th Hokage's head. After that, they had mutually decided to go steady for the first 2 years of their relationship, and they've been holding their relationship strong ever since. She smiled to herself as the image of Naruto held itself in her mind, her one and only, and no Sasuke to cut into her thoughts. As it had been told, Sasuke never did beat Itachi, but instead Itachi had killed Sasuke, and then later died of a disease that he was harboring. It was a shame that the Uchiha bloodline could never be replicated within a suitable host, but what did it matter? Konoha was fine with its remaining, and substantial amount, of noble families that were occupants of the village. Shizune stamped out the mission assignments that were stacked in the pile on the corner of the desk, and she was almost completed when Sakura burst into the office. Shizune stood from the chair that she was sitting in and stared directly into Sakura's eyes, which were wide with a new knowledge that Sakura was planning to share. Shizune-san, she's finally awake. Sakura exclaimed as she came to stop at the desk's edge. Has she told you anything yet? Shizune asked as she ran with the younger medic towards the hospital. No, but she said that she wanted to see you. I think she knows that we know. Sakura said as she reached out to the doors of the hospital. Well, maybe she'll tell us more if we're there together. Shizune said as they slowed their pace when they entered the hospital. At least we already know one half of the equation. She's definitely pregnant, Sakura whispered as they approached Tsunade's room. The two slowly entered the room and looked to the Hokage, propped up in her bed. She turned her head towards them and locked her amber eyes with those of green and obsidian, and sighed heavily, closing her eyes for a moment, then reopening them to look back to her apprentices. Close the door, please. she asked, which was obeyed. When the door was closed, Sakura and Shizune looked back to their mentor. Okay. Who did the checkup? She asked as she looked between the two of them. I did, Tsunade-sama. Sakura said with a straight face. A serious conversation was about to follow, and she wanted to appear as professional as possible to her boss and mentor. Okay. So then I will assume that you both know of my situation. Tsunade said as she looked both of the younger medics in the eyes, hands clasped across her legs. Both women nodded their heads at their mentor. She sighed heavily, turning her head to look out the window. Tsunade-sama, I hope that you don't find this offensive in a way, but may I ask who the father is? Sakura asked as she looked over at her mentor, who quickly turned her head back towards Sakura. Tsunade bit her lip and turned her head away from the two medics before her. Her mind was racing, her heart beating faster with her nerves. She couldn't tell them, she just couldn't. But they would figure it out eventually, and when they did, it would be far worse than just telling them who it is now. She was cornered, she knew this, but she had no choice but to tell her apprentices. She turned back towards the younger women with a serious face. She didn't want to do this, but she had to. If I tell you who the father is, you must promise that you'll never tell a soul about it. Understood. Consider this highly classified information. Tsunade said as she stared the younger women down. Hi, Tsunade-sama. Both young women said with a bow of their heads. Okay. This was an accidental pregnancy. We were both drunk, and completely beside ourselves with emotion. We shared momentary conversation, and that was all it took. When I woke up the following morning, I found my bed occupied by one other person. It was Jiraiya. Tsunade explained in a whisper, hoping that no one outside of the door could hear her. What? Both younger women asked as they looked at their mentor's straight face. You two heard me, and I won't repeat myself. Tsunade said as she folded her arms across her chest and leaned back against the bed. She sighed as she looked at the two women, who were now smiling broadly at their mentor. The two medics broke out into light squeals of happiness for Tsunade. After having found out about the baby that she was carrying, and now the father of said baby, each of them exchanged glances and shared a brainwave. They wanted to throw a private baby shower for Tsunade, but they didn't want to ask her for the time being because they knew she would turn it down, private or not. They silently decided to plan for one, and planned to throw it on a Saturday, which Tsunade had off. The two young women smiled at each other in silent agreement, and both turned back to Tsunade, who was now staring at them. One of her fine eyebrows at the mischievous smiles on both of their faces, she immediately regretted that they knew anything about her pregnancy at all. What are you two planning? She asked, but Sakura quickly looked away at the clock that hung on the wall. Oh my gosh, look at the time. I have to get back to work. She said quickly as she walked over towards the door. I have to get back to the office as well. Rest up Tsunade-sama. Shizune said happily as she walked out the door with Sakura. Tsunade could only watch as the two women walked out of the door and down the hallway. She shuddered at the thought of whatever they had planned, but she laid back down on the bed again. It wasn't every day that she just got to relax like this, so she would be damned if she was going to pass the opportunity up. She placed her hands on her stomach, and hummed in content before rolling over onto her side and falling into a deep sleep. Naruto was walking along the road on his way to the hospital to pick Sakura up from work, when he noticed her come out of the front doors with a huge smile on her face. He walked up behind her with a smirk on his lips, and wrapped his arms around her waist, nibbling lightly on her pale neck. She gasped in surprise, but quickly recognized her boyfriend's loving embrace, and leaned back into his chest. I missed you while you were working, anything go on today? Naruto asked as he hugged Sakura closer to him. I missed you too, baby. Nothing big happened today, just some broken bones, a few scrapes and bruises on some genin, and one major stab, but nothing overly serious. She replied as she nuzzled up closer to her boyfriend, deliberately refusing to say anything more about the day's events. Okay, Since you had such a good day, how about I treat you to dinner tonight? I just got paid for a big mission, and I wanna take you and your mom out. He said as he released Sakura from his firm grasp. We can check with her, but I'm free. Sakura replied as she turned towards Naruto and pecked him on the lips before nibbling on his lower lip. They pulled apart for a moment, and Naruto growled in response. I like where this is going, maybe we should skip dinner and go straight to dessert. Naruto replied seductively, reaching back out and wrapping his arm around her waist once more. No, let's go ask mom, and then we can go out together. Sakura said as she grasped Naruto's hand in hers and walked off towards her house. They had been able to tolerate each other's presence when Sasuke had been on their team, but now that he was gone, they were absolutely inseparable. They made their way towards the house, hand in hand, talking about the day's events. Naruto told her all about his mission, and how he had traveled to a handful of outlying villages, helping a few dignitaries with some tasks, before making his way to the Sand Village to help Gaara with a few moderate tasks that he had needed assistance with, mostly with the planning of the Chunin exam that would be happening in Wind Country that year. Sakura had told him of the days that had passed in the village, of how many of their friends were celebrating achievements and advancements of their own, how their senseis had continued to push them, and train them, even though many of them were no longer active ninja. Sakura talked the rest of the way to her home, and Naruto smiled as he listened to his girlfriend inform him of all the ins and outs of the village while he had been away. The duo soon became a trio heading towards one of their favorite restaurants, enjoying both the food and each other's company, before paying and heading home for the evening. As Naruto walked back down the streets of Konoha towards his godmother's house, he couldn't help but feel like he was the luckiest man in the world. The sun was bright in the midday sky as Shikamaru walked through Suna. He covered his obsidian eyes from the glare, and quickly made his way to the house of Suna's sand siblings. He was more active now that he had been assigned more traveling missions, but he was mostly asked to go to Suna over the other villages, though he'd made trips to them on occasion. He's been in Suna now for almost 5 months, and has slowly increased his already close relationship with the lone daughter of the Cage, Temari. He could never say enough about her, she was everything that he wanted and more, and they were in a relationship almost as strong as Naruto and Sakura's. I always think that these solo missions are just an excuse for Asuma-sensei to be with Kurenai-san. Shikamaru mumbled to himself as he approached the house of his favorite female and her brothers. He was more than likely right, but he never mentioned it in front of Asuma. He never wanted to give away the fact that he knew about their secret relationship. He merely shrugged his shoulders as he continued his trek, and then silently chuckled to himself at the thought of Asuma finding out that he knew about his affair with Kurenai. His face went back to its normal stature before he opened the door of the house that he was staying in during his mission, which he shared with the new Cage and his siblings. Kankuro was sitting on the couch watching TV, as per usual, and Gaara was in his study doing paperwork. Temari was more than likely upstairs tending to herself and not paying any mind to her younger brothers because they obviously didn't need it. Shikamaru walked casually into the living room and plopped down onto the recliner beside the couch. Kankuro looked over to the Leaf Shinobi and gave him a welcoming head nod, which Shikamaru returned. Both of them turned their heads towards the TV, which was showing the current news channel, but Shikamaru turned his head towards the stairs when footsteps were heard coming down from the second floor. Temari stood at the bottom step, eyes locked on Shikamaru, tears beginning to well up in her eyes from their time apart. It had been almost 4 months since she had last seen him. He had been doing a reconnaissance mission with one of Suna's shinobi teams, acting as one of the 2 team leaders, and aiding them in their tracking mission for that time. Shikamaru stood up from the chair and faced the stairs with a warm smile on his face, giving Temari all the answers she needed to let her tears flow. She ran forward to embrace her boyfriend in a welcoming hug, which he returned with almost the same amount of emotion. Temari was more than okay with him not showing his emotions, as he constantly told her that she showed more than enough for both of them, but when they saw each other for the first time in months, there was always just the start of tears in the corners of his eyes. Gaara walked from his study, greeting Shikamaru before taking the scroll that was offered to him. Mission details that Baki had given him to pass over to Gaara as they parted ways near the village entrance. Kankuro, still seated on the couch, smirked as he watched his sister practically haul Shikamaru up the stairs before turning his attention back over to the TV. Temari brought Shikamaru to her room, which had slowly become their room, and sat on the bed, patting the space next to her for him to join her. Shikamaru did as he was asked, but reclined against the pillows, motioning for Temari to follow suit, which she did. The two of them cuddled close together, embracing the silence that surrounded them. Temari cleared her throat after a few moments, and Shikamaru turned his attention towards her. Shikamaru, I was so worried about you. Temari whispered into his neck as she nuzzled closer to him. I missed you too, Temari. He whispered back as he kissed the top of her head. I kinda have something to tell you, she whispered to him with her eyes closed. What's wrong, Tem? Did someone upset you? Are you hurt? Shikamaru asked as he pulled his head away from Temari and looked down into her eyes. Well, but I did find out some exciting news. I'm pregnant, she replied, a small flash of hope sprang into her eyes. Shikamaru was stunned. His girlfriend of 10 months was pregnant with his baby. He could only stare at her, and then look down to her stomach with a somewhat confused look on his face. Temari only looked at Shikamaru, and the look on his face was making her worry more than she would have liked to. Her lower lip quivered involuntarily, and tears were forming in the corners of her eyes again as she watched Shikamaru glance between her face and her stomach. Then, he pulled her into a hug and kissed her passionately on the lips for longer than they ever had before, only stopping for air. I'm so happy, Temari. Thank you, he said as he pulled her closer to his body again. Oh Shikamaru, I'm so happy that you're happy about this. Temari replied as she nuzzled into his neck. I'm happy just because I'm with you. He replied as he held her in his arms. Does Gaara or Kankuro know? Have you told them yet? Shikamaru questioned as he looked down into Temari's eyes once again. No, they don't know yet. I wanted you to be the first person to know. Temari replied with small frown. Shikamaru knew how much she hated keeping things from her brothers, and with news this huge, he was surprised that she had done so. Shikamaru sat upright and moved from the bed, pulling Temari up with him. He led her back down to the living room and asked Gaara to join them, which the cage did without question. As the four of them found places to sit throughout the living room, Shikamaru cleared his throat. Temari and I have news to share. He began, looking between Temari and the boys. Temari nodded her head as Shikamaru caught her eyes. What is it? Gaara asked as he looked between the couple. I'm pregnant, Temari finally said as she looked between her brothers, waiting for their reactions. For a few minutes, nothing happened as the two boys processed what their sister had just said. And then, like lightning, realization struck both of them. Gaara, ever the calmer of the two, quietly pulled his sister aside to congratulate her on the pregnancy. Kankuro, on the other hand, was holding Shikamaru up by the collar of his shirt demanding that he be absolutely, 100%, faithful to his sister or he would throw him through a wall. Shikamaru agreed, as he would never think of hurting Temari, but more so thinking of his own safety at that moment. When Kankuro was satisfied that he had scared Shikamaru enough, he placed him back on the ground and went to congratulate his sister as well. Shikamaru collapsed into the chair. Kurenai paced her bedroom as she waited for Asuma to come and pick her up for their date. He was always late to an extent, but that was normal for him. She had always thought of it to be the cigarettes catching up to him, but they also weren't as young as they thought they were. Sure, they were young in a sense, but age was beginning to catch up to the two of them, and they were ready to settle down and retire from duty. She loved Asuma, and she was certain that he loved her, and they could do so much together, but she wanted more with him. She wanted a family with him, and she always thought that he wanted one as well. She knew that if she was going to have children, it should be awesome as children. Like a schoolgirl, she blushed at the thought, but a knock at the door brought her out of her thoughts, and she quickly moved into the living room. She ruffled her hair up once more before she opened the door. Asuma stood there in his best tuxedo, with his eyes on her and a cigarette in his mouth, where she had anticipated one would be. She was donned in a red dress that showed off her curvy figure, coming up to mid-thigh, and black tights, complete with a beautiful pair of crimson heels. Her black hair accentuated the dress, and it perfectly framed her face, making her crimson eyes pop. Asuma smiled at her, and she couldn't tear her eyes away from his beautifully chiseled face. He smiled at her flushed face, and gently cupped her chin in his hand. His touch was warm, full of love, and Kurenai couldn't help but flush a deeper red, even as he leaned in closer to her face. He gently pecked her lips, grasped her hand gently in his, and led her out of her apartment and onto the streets of Konoha. "You look stunning," Asuma rumbled, his voice low and rough as he gazed down at her. "You don't look so bad yourself." Kurenai chuckled, gripping his hand tighter in hers. She felt like a young girl, pining after the most handsome boy in the class, and the thought caused her to giggle. "What's so funny?" Asuma asked, snaking his arm around her waist. "Just comparing myself to a lovesick school girl," she replied, a smile spreading across her lips as she placed her hand atop his at her waist. "And I must be the boy that everyone's in love with?" he asked, a smirk on his face as they came upon the restaurant. "Well, the boy that I'm in love with," she replied, a devious smile forming on her lips. "Now you've earned detention after dinner," Asuma declared, gently tugging on a strand of Kurenai's ebony hair. All she could do was laugh and pull herself away from him, entering the building before he could catch her, and claiming their table before he had the chance to snatch her up into his arms. He joined her a moment later, smiling, chuckling even as she laughed right along with him. The rest of dinner went off without any further horseplay, and the two were soon on their way back to Kurenai's apartment, stopping once along the way to buy popsicles for dessert. When they came to her apartment, Kurenai led him inside and shut the door behind them, locking it for the night. When she turned back around, Asuma was there, and he immediately attacked her lips with kisses and nibbles, begging her for entrance. She complied as she led him, lip locked, down to her bedroom. Clothes were discarded to the floor as they got closer to the bed, until all Kurenai was left in was her bra and underwear, while Asuma donned a black pair of boxers. Once they made their way into bed, those were quickly removed and replaced with the sheets. Skin connected with skin, and Kurenai knew that, if she had had any doubts about how Asuma had felt about her, they had just been washed away with the pure pleasure that was rattling her brain. Eventually, they fell into slumber as their bodies gave into the desire for sleep. Tsunade rolled over uncomfortably in the hospital bed, and soon sat upright, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She slowly stood and made her way to the bathroom to fix herself up a bit after having spent the entire night puking her brains out. She swore that she'd kill Jiraiya if he ever so much as thought about being intimate with her ever again. Somewhere in the distance, a certain white-haired sage shivered in fear before turning his attention back to the buxom brunette that was currently in the hot spring he had chosen for observation purposes. What bullshit. Morning sickness in the middle of the night. If this keeps up, I'll just have Naruto take over until I give birth, complained the blonde Hokage, running a hand through her corn silk locks. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, eyes darting from her face down to her neck, and then down to the visible parts of her chest and abdomen. She may not have looked pregnant at the moment, but she most certainly felt pregnant. Why hadn't she quit after 3 drinks? Why didn't she consider the consequences of what the amount of drinking she did could do to her thought process? Her head was spinning with unanswered questions, and she had to grip the sink to keep from falling to the ground. Her heart was beating faster with each second, and it took several minutes for her to calm herself down enough to walk without stumbling, then to walk back to the bed to calm the raging river of nausea that threatened to take her over. Shizune and Sakura walked in and looked at their mentor, who was covering her eyes with her hands, while her back was turned towards them. Sakura walked over to the older woman and placed her hand gently upon her shoulder, giving it a squeeze. Tsunade rolled over and uncovered one eye, looking between Sakura and Shizune before she uncovered the other eye and eased herself up into a sitting position. Are you okay, Tsunade-sama? Sakura asked as she looked into her mentor's amber eyes. I'm fine, just a little dizzy. Tsunade mumbled as she faced the two younger women. Are you sure, Lady Tsunade? Would you like something to eat or drink? Shizune asked in a worried voice as she looked at her oldest friend and mentor. Tsunade shook her head, giving her a small smile. Okay, Tsunade-sama. I'll leave Shizune-san to check on you today. I have other patients to check in with this morning. Sakura said as she left Tsunade's hospital room and walked down the hall. I'm going to run a quick scan of the fetus, just to make sure it's developing on track. Shizune said as she walked over to the bed that her mentor was lying in. Tsunade nodded her head in response. Shizune walked up to the bed and made a dozen hand signs, producing a soft green glowing chakra from her hands. She gently placed her hands on Tsunade's exposed abdomen, and moved them around to find the tiny fetus that rested within the Hokage's womb. She found the fetal child, examined it as quickly as possible, and jotted down the results for Tsunade. After the initial inspection of the fetus, Shizune withdrew her chakra, and pulled her hands away from Tsunade's abdomen. The older woman looked up at her from the bed, and Shizune smiled down at her. The baby's perfectly healthy, and right on target for growth and development. Shizune stated as she looked into Tsunade's eyes. That's good to hear, Shizune. Thank you. Tsunade replied as she looked down at her developing stomach. My pleasure, Lady Tsunade. Shizune replied as she left the room. Tsunade put her hand on her stomach and held that pose for some time, her eyes never leaving her stomach as she sat there in perfect silence. Bringing herself from her daze, Tsunade removed her hand from her stomach and began to watch out the window, taking in the sunshine as it reflected off the small pond that was outside her room. Sure enough, as she did have the worst possible luck, the one person that she just didn't want to see walked into the room. Tsunade, are you alright? Jiraiya asked, concern lacing his voice as he looked down at his oldest friend. I'm fine, Jiraiya, Tsunade said, pulling the sheet up to her chest, fully covering her barely visible bump. What a relief. I thought that you were seriously hurt. It's not every day that you end up in a hospital unless you're working in one. He said with a light chuckle. Shut up, you pervert, Tsunade replied, anger present on her facial features, but a smile hidden in her eyes. Secretly, she didn't mind hearing him laughing, chuckling or full. It brought a sense of peace to her mind, and she loved hearing it whenever she could. He slowly walked over to her bed, and placed his hand upon hers in a friendly grasp. She didn't dare pull her hand away, his touch felt so warm on her chilled hand, and she didn't want him to let hers go. Damn it, why couldn't she control her own feelings anymore? Was she so contorted from overworking herself that she had forgotten who she was previously? She could only mentally shrug since she didn't dare to move from the position that she was lying in on the bed. Jiraiya sat down next to her on the bed, and gently took both of her hands in his own large hand. A small blush rose to her porcelain cheeks, and she could only hope that Jiraiya didn't see it. She got away this time, he didn't even notice. He stood up from the bed when a nurse walked in with Tsunade's dinner, saying that he would pop by again soon before he walked out of the room. She'd been in and out of sleep since she arrived yesterday morning, and had missed lunch that afternoon. She pleasantly greeted the nurse, and waited for her to place the tray on the bed. After the nurse left the room, Tsunade sighed in relief. She still didn't have the courage to tell Jiraiya that she was carrying his child. Naruto walked through the streets with his hands in his pockets, his mind traveling. His beautiful girlfriend was working, but that gave him plenty of time to get her birthday present. He smiled as he walked through the streets and towards the shopping district of Konoha. Villagers walking the street called him a hero, but he knew he was far from it. Sure, he'd injured Sasuke before he had fought against Itachi, but that was just a compilation of minor injuries. None of the villagers ever caused him any more problems, but that didn't stop him from being conscious of his surroundings. He slowly approached the flower store, and walked in to be greeted by Yamanaka Ino. Her smile was genuine, and had an older appearance after all of the things that she had gone through when she was a few years younger. Her mother had passed on when she was 10 years old, shortly after graduating from the academy, and she had just gone down from there every so often. "Good morning, Naruto-kun," Ino greeted as she looked up from the cash register. "Good morning, Ino-chan," Naruto replied with a smile as he walked up to the counter. "How can I help you today?" Ino asked as she stepped out from behind the counter. "I'd actually like a dozen red roses and a dozen pink roses," Naruto said as he looked around at the flowers that surrounded the shop. "Of course. I'm guessing that they're for Sakura-chan," Ino said with a smile. "It's only a part of her birthday gift. I've got more planned for her later," Naruto replied with a grin. "I know that she'll love them. You always manage to get her favorite colored roses," Ino said as she wrapped the 24 roses in a plastic wrapping and tied them with a light blue bow. Naruto walked up to the counter, paid Ino, and then walked out of the store with the roses. He quickly made his way back to his house and hid the flowers in his room in a vase so that they would live longer. He walked down the stairs and glanced at the clock. "Oh, it's already 3:30. I better hurry and go get those last few minor details worked out," he said as he walked out of his house and down towards the shopping district once again. Sakura was finished working at around 6 o'clock, and was walking out of the hospital when a voice sounded from behind her. She turned around on her heel, and looked at Tsunade's pale face. "Tsunade-sama, you shouldn't be out of bed," Sakura said as she walked over to the older woman and grasped her arm gently in her hand. "I'm fine, Sakura. I need to get home and then back to work tomorrow. Shizune can't keep working in the mansion for me," Tsunade replied as she staggered towards the door. "Tsunade-sama, I can't let you do that," Sakura said as she gripped the older woman's arm a little tighter. "Sakura, let me go," Tsunade said as she tugged her arm away from Sakura's grip. Sakura grasped a syringe from her hip and pierced it into Tsunade's arm, causing the older woman to gasp, and then start to teeter a little. Sakura securely grasped her mentor, and gently led her back to her hospital room, helping her situate herself back into the bed. "Now, Tsunade-sama, I want you to stay in bed, okay? No more added stress for you or the baby," Sakura said as the older woman slowly began to doze off. Tsunade could only nod her head in agreement as Sakura tucked her back into the bed, dimming the lights as she closed the door behind her. Sakura walked slowly down the hall, exiting the hospital before she was stopped again. She let out a sigh of relief after she left, and was soon wrapped in the embrace of her boyfriend's arms. She spun around in his loose grip and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her lips firmly to his in a welcomed, passionate kiss. "How was work?" Naruto asked as he held her in his arms. "It was wonderfully steady. No broken bones, and no deaths. How about you?" Sakura replied as she cuddled into Naruto's chest. "Sadly, not as interesting as yours probably really was. But, I'll survive," he replied dramatically, looking down into her eyes. "That's good to hear. Glad your day was good," she replied as she kissed his lips again. "I have some things that I have planned for us later, so I'll pick you up in an hour. Wear your best dress," he said with a grin. "Really? I'll be looking forward to it," she replied and kissed him before setting off for home. Naruto watched her walk off, and then he quickly made his way back to his house. He had to shower, so he quickly discarded his clothes, took his shower, and dressed in his best tuxedo. He managed to tame his hair slightly, but it was still just as spiky as it would always be. He sighed, defeated, and instead focused on knotting his tie around his neck. Completing that, He grabbed the 24 roses and walked out the door of his apartment. Following the street that he knew so well from all the times that he had walked her home, he made haste as he walked so that he could see her stunning figure once again. As he approached her house, he quickly adjusted his tux so that it was straightened out, and knocked on the oak door, patiently awaiting his princess. The door creaked open, and Sakura's mom stood in the doorway. She smiled when she laid eyes upon Naruto, and then welcomed him warmly into the house. "Thank you for inviting me in, Haruno-san," Naruto said as he bowed respectfully to the older woman. "You're very welcome, Naruto-kun. I'll get Sakura," she replied as she walked up the stairs to Sakura's room. Naruto rocked ever so slightly on his heels as he waited in the foyer of the Haruno household. He heard the footsteps of Sakura and her mom approaching the head of the stairs, and he took the roses he was holding and put them behind his back. Sakura walked down the stairs and stood on the final step, her eyes locked with Naruto's. She was wearing a stunning pink satin lace dress, with matching pink stilettos, and a black choker with a red rose pendant. Her hair framed her face so perfectly, just her appearance took his breath away. Naruto smiled at her and took the roses out from behind his back. Sakura gasped and took them from his hand as gently as a kitten, a smile gracing her lips as she gave him a quick peck on the lips. She walked back up the stairs to her room and placed the roses in a vase on her windowsill. She was soon back downstairs and looped her arm in Naruto's. "I'll be back later, Mom," Sakura said as she looked at her mother. "All right, Sakura. Have a good time, you too," Ms. Haruno said with a smile as she watched the two of them leave. Sakura cuddled up close to Naruto as they walked together through the streets of Konoha, a smile glued to her face the entire way to the restaurant. Naruto laced his fingers in Sakura's, placing a light peck on her cheek. A blush crept onto her face, and she beamed with happiness as he held her closer to him. They reached the restaurant, were seated, and then started to converse. "Naruto, how did you set this entire evening up without me noticing?" Sakura asked as she started to eat her dango. "I have ways of getting things done," he replied with a smile, biting into his teriyaki chicken. "You're such a sneak," Sakura teased with a smile. "But you know you love it," Naruto countered as he grinned at her. "It's one of your best qualities," she replied with a smile. "But I also have something else for you," Naruto said as he reached into his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a velvet box and handed it to Sakura over the table. She gasped, holding the box gently in her hands. She looked up at his smile, and then back down at the box. Slowly, she traced her fingers over the box, and then opened it. She gazed in at the diamond necklace that was lying in the box on a satin cushion. Tears were welling in her eyes, but a smile of pure joy was covering her face from ear to ear. She took the necklace out of the box and gazed at it with sparkles in her eyes. "Naruto, it's so beautiful," Sakura whispered as she continued to look at the necklace. "I thought it would be perfect for your birthday," he said as he stood from his chair and walked behind her to fasten the necklace on her neck. "Thank you, Naruto. I love it so much. It's perfect," she said as she touched the diamonds with her fingertips. "I knew you'd love it," he replied after fastening the necklace. The rest of dinner finished wonderfully with talk and the occasional kiss. They shared a quick dessert, and then were on their way back to Sakura's house. Shikamaru woke up almost an hour before Tamari, and had already taken the liberty of cooking breakfast with Kankuro. The puppet master was actually a fairly good cook, and Shikamaru enjoyed the company of another male hanging around with him. Don't think the wrong thing, he loved Temari's company, but sometimes, he just wanted to hang out with the guys now and then. Tamari was walking down the stairs when Shikamaru put her plate on the table with her silverware. She walked in and looked at her lover and brother strangely, never once seeing either one cook in her entire life, and made her way to the table where the prepared plate sat. "This isn't poisonous, is it?" she asked playfully as she looked over at the two men. "Do you think we're that evil, Tamari?" Kankuro scoffed as he looked over his shoulder at his sister. "Well, you are Kankuro. But I trust Shikamaru," Tamari replied as she smirked at her brother. Kankuro huffed at his sister's retort, but he continued to cook regardless. Shikamaru grabbed his plate and sat down next to Tamari at the table, giving her a warm smile as he did so. She returned it, and then took a bite out of the eggs that the two men had taken the liberty of cooking. Surprisingly, she didn't taste poison like she believed she would, and almost choked on her water at the false hurt looks Shikamaru and Kankuro gave her. Gaara joined them soon after, and the kitchen was soon filled with the noise of the four of them arguing, talking, and planning how they would baby-proof the house. Tamari sighed at how picturesque the moment was, and tucked it safely away in her memories, knowing that something like this would never happen again. She laughed when Shikamaru and Gaara got Kankuro to confess his love for a girl that he'd been seen with on occasion, and his face flushed a bright red. "You got to force Shikamaru, so now it's our turn," she exclaimed as she teased her brother about needing to buy a ring soon to ask the young shinobi to be his wife. "Shut up, Tamari," he growled out as he ate his eggs. His face was heating up with each passing moment. "Now, we all know that I need to approve any marriages in the family. Shikamaru is already part of this family, and I had no issue with him. Hinata is also part of the family, though unofficially. Now, Kankuro, I do want to meet her in person before I give my approval." Gaara spoke in his best cage voice, making both of his siblings groan. "Can we stop talking about this?" Kankuro begged as he looked between his siblings. "I guess. I actually want to eat more than I want to cause you emotional trauma." Tamari conceded with a devilish grin before turning her attention back to her plate. Kankuro breathed a sigh of relief, and also returned back to his breakfast with annoyance clearly expressed on his face. The rest of the morning passed relatively uneventfully, and the family was once again going over ways to baby-proof, what to buy, and names. Hinata had joined them after a small mission out of the village, and was soon brought up to date on all that had transpired in the last 2 days, headlined with Temari's pregnancy. Hinata was beyond excited for her, and demanded that the two of them take a spa day to celebrate. Kankuro and Shikamaru, of course, couldn't get them out of the house fast enough. Gaara simply stood back and laughed. Asuma had stayed the night, and the two of them were currently a tangled ball of limbs and sheets. Kurenai had a smile on her face, cuddling closer to Asuma's body, burying her head into his torso, and taking in the scent of his cologne. He smelled so good, and was so warm that she didn't dare move from where she was lying. He wrapped his arm tighter around her body, and she looked up to his tan face. He was looking down at her with a smile that told her that he was deeply in love with her, and she had the same look in her eyes for him. He smiled wider as he gently placed a kiss on her forehead. They remained like that for the next 2 hours before they decided to make breakfast. Asuma grabbed some eggs and the bread before joining Kurenai at the counter as she prepared some batter for pancakes. He, of course, wrapped his arms around her as he cracked the eggs into the bowl that she was stirring the mixture in, and she smiled, turning her head to kiss his cheek before returning her gaze to the bowl in her hands. Asuma toasted the bread and grabbed butter and jam from the fridge, as well as the plates and silverware, while Kurenai made perfectly golden brown pancakes. "Pancakes for the start of a perfect day," Asuma said as he took a few from the stack that Kurenai had brought over to the table. "I had a perfect night last night. Thank you for that," Kurenai replied as she took 2 of the pancakes for herself with a slice of toast. "The ending was pretty amazing as well," Asuma said with a wink as he took a bite of his pancakes. Kurenai couldn't help the blush that spread across her cheeks. Asuma teased her for a few more minutes before the two of them dressed for the day. Shizune said that there was a mission that they two of them could do together, and she was more than happy about sending them off to Kurigakure for diplomatic purposes with the Mizukage, Mei. The two of them went their separate ways to pack for their mission, not knowing how long they would be in Kiri. As they were leaving, Kurenai thought of how long they could potentially be gone, and she flushed a nice shade of red at the idea. They could be there for a month or longer, and it was just the two of them. No other shinobi, and neither of their teams would be with them either. Kurenai was beginning to think that Shizune had set them up on this mission deliberately, but had no time to think on it when Asuma suggested that they move a bit faster to make up a good length before they made camp that night. Sunlight fluttered in through the window of Tsunade's hospital room, and she slowly opened her eyes to the day. Looking over to her left, she spotted Jiraiya, sleeping in the chair that was in the corner of the room. He looks so cute when he's asleep. Tsunade thought as she looked at the white-haired Sannin. She shifted into a sitting position, and looked over at him again, watching his chest rise and fall with his rhythmic breathing. She watched him until he started to stir in the chair, eyes blinking as he began to take in his surroundings, and that's when she shifted her gaze over to the window, watching the curtains float in the wind and the birds that flew past the window. A smile had slowly graced her lips as she watched the birds that flew by on the airwaves. She could hear Jiraiya move from the chair as his sandals clicked on the floor. "Good morning, Tsunade," he said as he stifled a yawn. "I would hardly call it good when you're sneaking into my room while I'm sleeping." Tsunade retorted gruffly, eyes locking onto him as he moved towards her bed. "I'm sorry, Tsunade. You just looked like an easy target, and I couldn't just sit by and wait for someone to attack," he said as he sat on the bed next to her. "You do know that's why I have Anbu guards stationed outside of my door, and the window," she replied as he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. She couldn't help the small smile that formed at his touch. "You're way too serious sometimes, Tsunade. Lighten up a little," he said as he started to rub her shoulders. "Jiraiya, you'd have had fewer broken bones if you were more serious as a genin," Tsunade countered, a smirk spreading across her lips as she turned to look into his eyes. "That was cold, Tsunade," he grumbled, huffing out a puff of air as he looked away from her. "Says the man who's acting like a child," she chuckled, his chest with her elbow. Jiraiya stood from the bed, stretched, and faced her once more. "I've gotta head out. Reconnaissance information doesn't gather itself," he joked, moving towards the door of the room. "And by information, you mean peeking, correct?" Tsunade questioned, a playful grin on her face. "Well, I wouldn't be as widely acclaimed as I am without the occasional break for research," he replied, a blush forming on his cheeks as he gave Tsunade a goofy grin. "You're hopeless," she sighed, gripping the bridge of her nose in annoyance. "You asked," he countered, laughing as she grimaced. He pulled the door open and looked over his shoulder. "If you wanna talk sometime, just have Naruto get me," he said as he walked out the door. Tsunade sighed as she laid back against the pillows. That man, who she was so madly in love with, and the father of her child, was going to drive her absolutely nuts by the end of her pregnancy, possibly longer if she didn't punch him out of the village, or kill him. She looked down at her abdomen and sighed again as she pressed her hand to the sheet. "Your father is something else, little one. But you'll grow to love him," she whispered as she rubbed her thumb against the loose fabric of the sheet. With that, she eased herself back into the silence that surrounded her, listening to the gentle sound of the birds chirping outside of the window. Sakura or Shizune would be by soon to check on her, but all she wanted was the peace that was currently in her grasp. Oh well, a minor disturbance was all well and good if it was either of her students, or even the boisterous Naruto. What she wouldn't give to see him right now, the little ball of energy. She wondered to herself how he treated Sakura for her birthday the other day, and mentally planned to ask her when she came into work that morning. Not even an hour later, Sakura did walk into her room, and was immediately checking her vitals with a small hello. Tsunade sat upright as Sakura worked, and as soon as the younger woman was finished checking her vitals, Tsunade cleared her throat, bringing Sakura's attention to her. "How was your birthday?" she asked as she looked into Sakura's eyes. A small blush soon creeped over her skin. "That good," Tsunade chuckled as Sakura blushed even darker. "We just had dinner," she defended as Tsunade began to laugh a little harder. "And what else did that little fireball do for your birthday?" "He got me roses. 12 red, 12 pink. And he bought me this beautiful necklace." Sakura explained as she pulled the chain from beneath her shirt. Tsunade inspected the diamonds on the chain as Sakura showed it to her, and she smiled in content at the gift. The boy has taste in jewelry, I'll give him that. Tsunade laughed as Sakura placed the chain back under her shirt. I love it. Last night was so perfect, Tsunade-sama. Sakura beamed as the night's events played out in her mind. You had a good time, and the kid got you something nice, that's what matters. Tsunade said as she reclined back into her pillows. He's wonderful. We didn't even have to go out to dinner. I would have been fine eating at home, but he insisted. There are days where I think he's more than I deserve, and then he reminds me that I'm all he'll ever want. Sakura gushed as she thought of Naruto. Tsunade smiled in content. Her godson was proving himself in so many ways, and not just to the villagers. He was changing into more of a man every single day, and she couldn't be more proud of him if she tried. Sakura continued to talk about last night as she checked over the baby and wrote down notes on Tsunade's chart, and then finished by saying that Naruto had walked her home and made sure that she was safely in her house before he would move from the front steps. The two of them conversed for a few more minutes before Sakura had to excuse herself to make her rounds. Tsunade waved her off with a smile before turning back to the open window, once more taking in the sight of butterflies hovering over the tulips outside her window. Days had passed into weeks, and the weeks had turned into 4 months. Tsunade was pushing just over 5 months pregnant now, and other ninjas were starting to wonder why she seemed to be larger than she had been. Jiraiya was starting to wonder as well, and he had confronted Tsunade more than once about her slowly changing figure. She had developed slightly wider hips, her stomach wasn't as flat as it had been, and her had become larger. Fuller to be exact. She was standing in her house right now, measuring herself up in the mirror. She was distasteful of her new figure, but she didn't have the time to contemplate on that now. She should have thought about that 5 months ago at the party. She sighed angrily and walked over to her closet to grab her change of clothes. For the time being, she was still small enough to fit into her normal clothes, which were a little baggy anyways, and she also had her jacket to cover her stomach during the day. She was no longer affected by her morning sickness, for which she was eternally grateful for, and her cravings were relatively normal compared to most women in their second trimester. Having changed for the long day ahead of her, she slowly moved her hand over her stomach. Time to go, little one. She whispered as she gently gripped the fabric of her shirt before turning away from the mirror. She gathered her jacket and walked out of her bedroom, down the stairs, and out the front door. A gust of wind greeted her as she walked out of her house, and she quickly put her jacket on. Her eyes looked up to the gray clouds above, and she shuddered as another gust of wind hit her skin. Looks like it's going to be a bad day for missions. She thought as she pulled her jacket closer around her body. She quickly made her way to the Hokage mansion and she was greeted at the door by Shizune, who was now walking with her and trying to tell her something about someone in her office, but she was far from focused on the name, assuming that it was a ninja back from a mission. When she opened the doors, however, her eyes instantly met with those of Jiraiya. His eyes pierced through her very soul, and she felt her heart start to race as she made her way into the office. His smile brought up feelings in her that she hadn't felt in the years since Dan's death, and she hadn't even begun to think of loving another since then. She looked down to the floor as she walked past him to her desk, and when she sat down she dismissed Shizune from the office with a wave of her hand. Shizune bowed respectfully to her mentor, and quickly made her way down to the main level of the building. What do you need, Jiraiya? Tsunade asked as she finally lifted her face to him. I have to ask you a serious question, he stated as he looked her directly in the eyes. Fine, but make it quick. I have work to do, she replied as she looked down to her desk, and the stack of mission reports that sat off to her right. Tsunade, I've noticed a change. I've noticed it on some women before, but never thought I'd see it on you. Are you pregnant? He asked after a pause, trying to catch Tsunade's gaze as she went from looking at her desk to looking at the door. Jiraiya, she began. not knowing how to tell him that, yes, she was pregnant, but avoiding the paternal lineage. He moved from the front of her desk to her side, not knowing if he should comfort her, or let her sort her thoughts out first. She struggled internally for several minutes, fighting how she was going to tell him, and yet, try to avoid the inevitable. She sighed before turning her gaze over to him, and looking him dead in the eyes. She hadn't even noticed that a tear had fallen from her eye until Jiraiya brushed it away with the pad of his thumb, gently cupping her cheek in the process. As much as his touch sent electricity through her, she gently removed his hand from her skin and took another deep, steadying breath. Will you tell me? Jiraiya asked his former teammate with a hint of dejection in his eyes. Tsunade nodded her head once. I'll tell you, she said with downcast eyes. Just tell me what you feel comfortable telling me. He conceded with a smile. Yes, you're right, I am pregnant, she said as she looked up at him. Well, I've always wanted to be right in an argument with you, but I never thought it would be an argument like this. He spoke softly, and Tsunade could faintly hear the hurt in his voice. He had always wanted it to be them in the end, and here she was, carrying his child, and she didn't have the strength to tell him that it was his. Her heart broke a little at the sight of the man before her, thinking that his chance was now forever gone. Jiraiya, she whispered with the same amount of hurt and confusion in her own voice. Don't worry about it, I'll leave now, he said with a sad smile before turning and making his way out of the door, closing it gently behind him. Tsunade couldn't help the flood of emotions that were now coursing through her body. In her silence, she had broken Jiraiya's heart, she knew this, but she also didn't want him to know anything more about her pregnancy than necessary. She didn't want him to know that it was his baby, at least not yet. She just couldn't put herself in that position again, having the man of her dreams, and then having him taken away from her. Her heart had barely gotten over Dan's death all those years earlier, and she couldn't bring herself to see Jiraiya slip through her fingers the same way. And as swiftly as her emotions had become tender, they suddenly flared with a new, raw anger that she wasn't expecting. Her blood boiled as she looked at the door, waiting for Jiraiya to come back so that she could properly lob a book at his head for making her feel so powerless. She slammed her hands onto her desk, palms down, and scattered paperwork across her office. Without a second thought, she grasped the back of her chair, and spun towards the window, throwing the chair in the process. Glass shattered onto the lower roof below the window, and some collected on the floor beneath her feet, but she could care less. She sat down on her desk with a huff, arms folded before her chest, as she stared out the now shattered window at the sky above. The damn fool. She sighed angrily as she thought of Jiraiya, before she shook her head and placed both hands on her stomach. The baby had begun to spin and tumble around, stretching out and pressing against her bladder and stomach, and was now finally beginning to stop moving and rest once again. She rubbed a few circles over her abdomen, feeling her child's feet press against her hand, and resorted to massaging that specific spot. She sighed again. Little one, your father is an idiot, and your mother is a stubborn fool. She sighed out as she stood from her desk and made her way towards the door of her office, placing her hand against the old wood that had been there for years. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she made her way to the corner of her office, sliding down the wall onto the floor below, bringing her knees as close to her chest as possible and burying her face into them. Small sobs escaped as all of the emotions that she'd pent up over the past 4 months came to light, sending her into heaving convulsions as the tears fell freely down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, Jiraiya, and my little one, she choked out between sobs. She held her abdomen protectively in her arms as she tried desperately to stop shaking, knowing that the tears would stop with time. Naruto had seen his Ba-chan's chair fly out the window, and so he decided to check it out. He made his way onto the roof that sat below the now shattered window, then he jumped onto the windowsill. The sight before him was tear-jerking, to say the least. Tsunade, one of the strongest shinobi in the village, was sitting in the corner of the room, her head buried in her knees, most likely crying. Her body was shaking, and his hearing finally found the sound of the light sobs he dreaded were there. He slowly climbed in the window and stood behind Tsunade's desk, waiting for her to notice him. When she didn't move, or flinch, Naruto made his presence known. He took a calming breath before speaking, as the sight before him had agitated him in a way he hadn't been upset before. "Tsunade-ba-chan, are you alright?" Naruto asked as he knelt down on the floor by her desk. Tsunade's head shot up from her knees and she flashed her tear-stained face towards the one and only, Uzumaki Naruto. She gasped and quickly turned her head towards the wall, wiping her eyes with her right hand and covering her stomach beneath her knees with her left. "Naruto, what are you doing here?" she asked as she faced him again after drying her eyes enough to look at him. "Coming to check what all the fuss is about. You threw your chair out the window again," he said with a small smile. "I had good reason to," she replied as she put her hands down by her sides. "Let me guess, Ero Sennin?" Naruto asked with a smirk. "Yes. But it wasn't all his fault this time. It was mine too," Tsunade replied as she slowly stood up from the floor. Naruto shook his head and walked over to Tsunade, helping her pull herself up from the floor. When she was fully standing, he gently wrapped his arms around her shoulders, and pulled her close to him. Tsunade reciprocated the hug that Naruto offered her, and buried her face into his shoulder, tears threatening to fill her eyes once again. Naruto, sensing her need for contact, simply held her tighter, refusing to be the first one to pull away from the embrace. Tsunade, not feeling the need to pull away herself just yet, continued to hug Naruto as well, knowing that Naruto knew her well enough to pick up on her feelings. The two of them stayed that way for several minutes, until they heard a light knocking on the door next to them. Tsunade gently squeezed Naruto's shoulder before having him open the door while she made her way back to her desk. Naruto did as he was asked, and as the door swung open, he laid eyes on Sakura, and couldn't help the smile that came to his lips. She gave him an alluring smile, pecked him on the lips, then made her way into the office and over to Tsunade's desk. Naruto was captivated by the way she moved, and only looked away when Shizune nudged him as she walked in. He flushed a slight crimson before the sound of Sakura's voice brought him from his thoughts. "Naru-kun, I have to ask you to leave for a moment," Sakura said with a small smile. "So soon? But you just got here," Naruto said with a grin as he looked back at Sakura. "Come on Naru-kin, I have to attend to Tsunade-sama right now," she said with a grin of her own before blowing him a quick kiss. He frowned for a moment but knew that it would be best if he left, not only for Sakura, but for Tsunade as well. Before he left, he took another look at her and noticed that she was shaking once again, and his heart clenched tightly in his chest. Shizune, noticing the look in his eyes, gently assured him that Tsunade would be fine, that she and Sakura would take good care of her and make sure that she was feeling better by that afternoon. Naruto nodded his head and then looked back over to Tsunade, who was now giving him a soft smile, which he returned before heading down the hallway as Shizune shut the door behind him. He jumped out one of the hallway windows and onto the roof of a nearby building, basking in the sun for just a moment until a thought struck him. "I'll go to the memorial stone today, I wanna stand there for a moment," he thought as he headed over towards the magnificent blue stone where the names of fallen shinobi had been written down for the past 100 or so years. He walked slowly through the busy streets, greeting many villagers and other lounging shinobi as he passed them by. They returned his greetings with various greetings of their own, handshakes, head nods, a quick hug, a smile, or a verbal greeting back. His trek was slow, as he was trying to kill time, but he finally made it to the stone, only to see his sensei, the copy nin, Hitaki Kakashi. He was standing in front of the stone with Chunin exam proctor, Mitarashi Anko. The two of them were standing side by side, hands enlaced, and eyes locked on the stone. Kakashi, completely engrossed by his observation of the names on the stone, was oblivious to everything except for Anko and said stone. Naruto walked up to the couple, hands in his pockets, and looked on towards the stone along with them. I know how you feel, Kakashi-sensei. Naruto said quietly as he stared down to the stone. It's hard, isn't it? Kakashi said as he looked over to Naruto from the corner of his eye. He knew Naruto understood death the same way he did. Both of them had lost a teammate, and one that they considered a close friend. It was harder for Naruto, because he had considered Sasuke more like family than just a friend. The young blonde nodded his head, while small traces of tears began to sting at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back, not wanting to appear weak in front of Kakashi or Anko, yet knowing that neither of them would care if he shed a tear over the one he had called friend. He had trained tirelessly, both with Kakashi, and then with Jiraiya, but no matter how hard he worked, he just couldn't seem to bring Sasuke back with him. They had encountered each other on multiple occasions, but Sasuke always managed to get away. The last time they fought, Naruto had given him a near-fatal wound that Sasuke ignored in order to fight his elder brother, Itachi. The wound made him slower, weaker, and Itachi had killed him in combat. Itachi would later make his way to Suna, and died in one of the hospitals there. Gaara, in an act of true compassion, had asked if it would be okay for him to have Itachi's body transported for proper burial in Konoha, to which Tsunade agreed. When Sasuke's body was found later on, the same had been requested of him, with the same outcome. Naruto looked at both of their names in silence before bowing his head to say a quick prayer for both Uchiha boys. Kakashi cleared his throat a few minutes later. Well, Anko, I think that we'd better get going, Kakashi said as he gripped Anko's hand in his. I think you're right, she replied as she walked with him away from the memorial stone. You'd better be on time tomorrow, Kakashi-sensei. Naruto yelled as he watched the two of them walk away. Kakashi gave him a wave of his hand as he walked off, more than likely smiling to himself under that damn mask that he'd always worn. Naruto looked back to the memorial stone, and held a serious face as he looked over one name that he was quite familiar with now. Namikaze Minato, the name of his deceased father and fourth Hokage. His mother had always been listed in the old shinobi files as deceased, and many claimed that she was simply just missing after his birth and the sealing, but Naruto never knew for certain what had happened to her. Naruto could never bring himself to the realization that his mother could be dead. He'd always thought that she was only in another village because she couldn't handle the fact that her husband had died sealing a demon inside of his own son, their one and only son. Of course, Naruto had only recently learned of his parents, having pestered Tsunade, even when she tried to hold it off for as long as she could. But Naruto was persistent to find out the truth about his past. Tsunade was reluctant at first, but some extra coaxing from Jiraiya prompted her to spill. She told Naruto everything. About how his mother had come from the now-gone Whirlpool village, how his parents had met at the academy, how they had grown together in strength and feelings, their marriage, when they found out Kushina was pregnant, his birth, and his sealing. And after hearing the truth, Naruto had, of course, flipped out with excitement. It had taken both Sannin several minutes to get the fox child to calm down, but they were able to do it. Tsunade was compelled to punch him into a wall, but Jiraiya had managed to calm her down enough to just bonk Naruto on the top of his head. Naruto smiled slightly at the memory from just 2 weeks ago, but the knock on his head still felt fresh. He ran a hand over the mark involuntarily. He sighed sadly and turned away from the stone with slumped shoulders. His heart clenched slightly in his chest as he thought of his mother, and how he longed to have her in his life once again. His young mind began to work up an idea, then a plan, and soon he was running full speed towards the Hokage mansion. He wanted Tsunade to approve of this, wanted to search for his lost mother, wanted to hear her voice call his name. He pumped his legs harder the closer he got to the mansion. If he knew Tsunade at all, he knew that she would approve of anything that involved his family. Here's to hoping, he thought as he ran up the stairs of the mansion, made his way down the hallway, and pushed his way through the doors. Tsunade's head shot up at the sound of the doors being shoved open, and a silent sigh escaped her throat as she looked at the exhausted frame of Naruto. He was leaning over, huffing with exhaustion, but he did manage to lift his head to smile at her. She looked at him with a half smile, and his small smile turned into a grin as he was able to stand again. Naruto, what is it? Tsunade asked as she stood from her chair and looked at the younger blonde before her. Ba-chan, I want to put a team together to look for mom. Naruto got out between breaths and gasps. A retrieval team for Uzumaki Kushina. There hasn't been one of those since you were a toddler. Tsunade said as she eased herself back down into her chair, never taking her eyes off of Naruto. Why did they stop? Did they find something that proved she was actually dead? Naruto asked, panic beginning to form in his eyes. No, there was never anything found about her anywhere. There had been several attempts to find her after the sealing, but none of them ever turned anything up. She simply vanished. Tsunade reassured Naruto, though it was more of a long shot at getting the boy to calm. But there's a chance, right? A chance that she could still be alive somewhere. Naruto asked again as he looked deeply into Tsunade's eyes. Possibly. The Uzumaki clan had a very close bond with the Senju clan. Both of them were survival clans. If there was ever a chance that she could be alive, it is simply because survival is ingrained in her blood. Tsunade replied as she opened her desk drawer to pull out an old file that Sarutobi had put away there. She placed the old, tattered file on the desk and motioned for Naruto to take it. What is this? He asked as he pulled the folder towards him. Your mother's file. It details everything about her, from her height and weight at the time of her disappearance, to her known affiliate locations in the other countries. Like you, she once harbored the nine-tail, as did my grandmother before her. Perhaps Kurama could help you find her based on her chakra signature. It should be more than familiar to him. Tsunade explained as she looked at the young man before her. Naruto remembered the day he had told both Tsunade and Jiraiya about Kurama, and how the two of them formed at the time, working relationship for Naruto to gain strength and experience. Over time, the two of them had become closer day by day, and it was only a matter of time before they had their successful tailed beast fusion. Jiraiya had written a scroll back to Tsunade about how Naruto and the nine-tailed had fused together, and perfected a tailed beast bomb together. When the duo returned from their training missions, Tsunade was already at the gate demanding that they tell her everything about the nine-tail, and how Naruto was suddenly able to work so closely with the demon fox's chakra. Naruto had spoken freely of the entire mission once they were back at the mansion, and Tsunade had listened intently to everything that he said. Naruto stood there in silence for a moment, and Tsunade couldn't mistake the flash of red chakra that had formed around his hand that held the folder. Kurama said he'd help me pinpoint her location. Naruto finally said after the chakra had subsided. Now, what makes you think that I'll even let you go? Tsunade asked with a devilish grin as she looked over at Naruto again. Because you're the greatest Hokage ever. Naruto said with a sugar-coated smile. Tsunade sighed with a smile, knowing full well that Naruto would do whatever he could to form this retrieval team for Kushina. Her maternal instincts kicked in, and a swell of emotion took hold of her thoughts. Here was the boy that she had grown to love like he was her own, standing before her as a young man who wanted to fulfill his one dream that remained from his childhood. Finding any living members of his family. She turned her chair to look out the window to her right, staring up at the sky and watching the birds pass by. Her heart was equal parts overjoyed and saddened at Naruto's request. She knew that he knew this, seeing as she was the one who practically raised him once she was fully settled in the village. She'd been there for every cut, bruise, laceration, cold, flu, fever, and break. Now she was faced with the decision to let him search for the woman who had abandoned the boy that Tsunade had taken care of. She sighed again before a pair of arms wrapped around her shoulders from behind. She leaned her head against the back of the chair, and felt Naruto rest his own atop hers. You don't have to worry about it right now, Tsunade. I understand if you don't want to give me an answer as of yet. Naruto whispered as he nuzzled his head onto Tsunade's shoulder. It's a complicated request, Naruto. We don't even have a location where Kushina was last seen, let alone if she still looks the same, or if she's been living under a constant genjutsu for the last 19 years. I don't want you to lose hope, but I also don't want you to be disappointed. Or hurt. Tsunade said in a quiet voice as she turned her head just slightly to catch Naruto's expression. Naruto squeezed Tsunade into a slightly tighter hug, and he buried his face further into her neck as a few tears welled up in his eyes. Tsunade brought her hand up and placed it on Naruto's spiky hair, ruffling it around her fingers. She noticed then just how similar Naruto was to Minato. The same never-give-up attitude, the fierce loyalty to family above all else, and the determination to see every situation through to the end. She smiled slightly and held this position with Naruto for a few more minutes before she finally spoke to him. Naruto, listen, I want you to find her. I really do. So I'll permit the retrieval team. Tsunade whispered as she cupped his cheek in the hand that had fallen from his hair. Really? You're going to let me do this? Naruto asked, almost as if to prove that he wasn't dreaming just now. Of course I am. What kind of Hokage would I be if I didn't let one of my own finish a mission, personal or not? Tsunade asked with fake hurt etched into her expression. Ba-chan, you're the greatest. Naruto exclaimed as he wrapped his arms around her again. Easy there, Naruto. I'm nowhere near ready for any of your bear hugs. Tsunade laughed as she patted Naruto's head. Sorry, Tsunade. I forgot in the moment. Naruto apologized as he released his grip. Well, go on. You've got a team to assemble. Tsunade waved him out of the office with a smile on her face. Naruto, of course, did as he was told. Tsunade sighed and looked back out the window, once again letting her thoughts trail over the boy who'd just left her office. She could see him bounding over the tops of buildings on his way to the hospital, no doubt to inform Sakura of his impending mission, and she almost knew exactly where he would be going after that. Naturally, he would want a tracking team, and it was only natural for him to run off towards Konoha's best tracking compounds. The Inuzuka and Abrum clans. From there, he would most likely head over to the Hyuga clan and request for Neji to join them, since having a Byakugan user would certainly come in handy with their near 360-degree sight radius, and the ability to see over a long distance. He'd probably try to rope Shikamaru Nara into his team as well, and from the letter that she'd received from Gaara recently, she was doubtful that the now pregnant Tamari was going to let him out of her sight. She chuckled as she watched him disappear to the streets below, then turned back to the paperwork that was now placed back on her desk from this morning's emotional outburst. She did have to admit, though, that the breeze from the broken window did heighten her mood a little bit. Naruto bounded down the road with a smile plastered on his face. As he entered the hospital, he immediately made his way down the hallway to Sakura's office, and when his eyes landed on the pink hair through the window, he showed himself in. He leaned down and pecked her cheek before sitting on the edge of her desk, which was annoying, but Sakura permitted it this time at the sudden change in her boyfriend's mood from this morning. Good afternoon to you too, Naruto. Sakura said as she returned his playful peck with one of her own. I've got some news to share. Naruto said with a large grin spreading across his face. And what would that be? Sakura questioned with a laugh as she held his hand in her own. I went to Tsunade about finding my mom. We talked about it for a bit, but she finally gave me permission to make a retrieval team to search for her. Naruto said with the most enthusiastic grin Sakura had ever seen on him. That's wonderful, Naruto. Have you thought about who to bring yet? She asked, already formulating a team in her own mind. You for sure. A team always needs a medic along for the mission. I was also thinking of Kiba for tracking, and maybe Shino. Anyone else you can think of? Naruto asked as he gripped her hand in his again. I like having Kiba and Shino along. They are natural trackers, and they work amazingly well together. You could also ask Neji to be on the team, since the Byakugan has a near-perfect circle of sight, and it's able to pick up the chakra network, and it has a relatively long range of sight. You could also ask Shikamaru to be a part of the team. He's an excellent shinobi, and he can formulate plans and attack patterns on the fly. He also knows the layout of Suna like the back of his hand, and would be incredibly helpful in landscape analysis. Sakura listed off as she thought of each member and their ability. Naruto was nodding his head in agreement with Sakura's words and suggestions, and when she mentioned all of the people that she could, a smile plastered across his face as he realized who he was going to ask to join him and Sakura. He smiled, leaned in, and gave Sakura a chaste kiss on the lips before he ran out of her office and down to the Inuzuka compound, where 2 nin dogs inspected his scent out front. They barked their approval, and Naruto quickly walked past and down the road towards Kiba's home. A knock on the front door brought Kiba out of his half-slumber, and when the knocking persisted, his temper began to flare. He stood from the couch and made his way over to the front door, Akamaru and Kuromaru following at his heels. Better him to get the door than his ma, that much he could figure out on his own. Sum was a whole different kind of crazy when she was angered, and Kiba figured he'd save the poor soul at the door her wrath. Having not fully woken up, he didn't even bother to sniff the air for the scent of their visitor, and was surprised to open the door and find Naruto standing there with his fist raised to knock on the door again. "Oi, Naruto, you called it knocking?" Kiba asked with a yawn as he scratched the back of his head. "Yay, what do you call it?" Naruto asked as he followed Kiba back into the living room. "A death wish if Ma had gotten to you before I did." Kiba replied with a grin as he sat back down on the couch. Naruto joined him immediately. "Well, thanks for saving me from Sum. Won't lie, she does scare me," Naruto said as he thought of the elder Inuzuka leader. "You're not the first person to say that," Kiba replied as he scratched at Akamaru's ears. Kuromaru, feeling a bit left out, placed his head on Naruto's lap. Naruto, startled at first by the large nin dog's actions, began to mimic Kiba's actions, earning a pleased growl from the canine. "Kiba, what the hell was all that banging about?" Sum yelled from the other room. "Don't worry about it, Ma. It's just Naruto," Kiba yelled back, returning his attention to Akamaru and inspecting his fur for potential burrs from the yard. Footsteps came from the kitchen, down the small hallway, and then behind them in the doorway. "Naruto. Glad to see you, kid. It's been a while since you were last here," Sum commented as she came up to the back of the couch and ruffled his hair. "Long time no see, Sum-san. How have clan duties been?" Naruto asked politely, fearing to cause Sum any feeling of disrespect, regardless of being a friend of Kiba's since childhood. "Boring as hell, but worth it. I'm trying to get the pup here off his to start taking some of them on himself," Sum replied with a snarl as she put her hand on Kiba's head. "Ma, come on. Naruto didn't just come to hear about clan duties and obligations. I'm almost certain that he came to ask me something." Kiba fussed as he shook his head free of his mother's hand. "At least he seems interested in my duties as clan leader, unlike the future clan leader," Sum replied as she stood from her leaning position on the couch, calling Kuromaru to her side. The canine pulled his head from Naruto's lap and went to his owner's side. "It was nice to see you, Sum-san," Naruto said as he turned to look at the elder Inuzuka. "The same to you, Naruto. Keep the pup in line for me, will you?" she said with a grin before turning around to head back to the kitchen. Kuromaru's claws clicked on the wood as he followed behind his owner. Kiba and Naruto both sighed in relief that Sum had returned to the kitchen, and was, for the most part, out of earshot. When they were certain that they could speak privately again, Naruto turned to look at Kiba. "So, I have a mission planned out, and Tsunade has approved it," Naruto began as he looked at Kiba, who had perked up at the word mission. "Oh yay, what is it?" he asked as he turned his own head to look at Naruto. "So, my mom disappeared from the village after the 9 tail was sealed in me. No one could find her, and I mean no one. So I went to Tsunade today, and asked if I could put together a new tracking team to find her. It took a bit of coaxing, but she agreed, and here I am, asking if you'll be a member of that tracking team. Naruto explained as he looked hopefully at Kiba. Like you even had to ask if I would go on a mission with you. Who else do you have planned to ask? Well, it was you, Shino, Neji, and Shikamaru. If I'm in, Shino is in, no questions asked. I'll go talk to Neji, let him know the situation, and you should write a letter to Shikamaru. I assume that we aren't going to leave until all of us are assembled together. You got that right. If you could talk to Neji for me, I'd appreciate it. Consider it done. And thanks for the invite. I'm more than happy to provide my canine services, and I'm sure Akamaru would like to get out and do another tracking mission. His nose could use the practice. Kiba joked as he scratched his nin dog's head. Akamaru huffed in response before moving to lay in a patch of sunlight by the patio door. I'll catch you later, Kiba. That letter won't write itself, Naruto said as he made his way back to the front door. I'll fill Shino in on the way to Neji's, no problem. Naruto closed the door behind him and made his way out of the compound and back towards home, going over the letter that he would write Shikamaru in his mind the entire way there. Kiba and Shino made their way over to the Hyuga compound, both discussing the mission that they had agreed to be a part of. Kiba, true to his word, did inform Shino of Naruto's plan, and Shino had agreed to go along with Kiba, as Kiba knew he would. The two of them made their way towards the back of the compound, where many of the branch family members lived near the main house, and knocked on Neji's door. He answered and ushered them in right away, noticing the serious looks of his cousin's teammates. The three of them made their way to the living room, where they sat around a traditional low-set table. Neji brought water out to the table as they all made themselves comfortable on the cushions. What brings the two of you here with such serious expressions? Neji questioned as he looked between Kiba and Shino. It's about Naruto. I guess Tsunade gave him permission to set up another retrieval team, but this time it's to search for his mother. Guess no one has seen her since the nine-tail attack on the village. I guess she was also a carrier for the beast, so Tsunade and Naruto both think that the nine-tail would recognize her chakra network if it were close enough to be tracked, but your eyesight gives us a bigger advantage. Sakura told him to ask you, but since he came to me first, and he needs to write to Shikamaru, I told him I'd come in his place. Plus it gave me a chance to ask Shino first. Kiba explained, fidgeting with the tablecloth a little as he spoke. Sitting for too long made him antsy. It would be nice to get out of the village for a while. And I'm sure that Naruto is already brimming with enough energy for all of us to get moving. This is a substantial retrieval mission, and I'm almost positive he would have left yesterday if he could. A mission this important, you know I wouldn't turn it down. Neji replied as he took a sip of his water. Since Naruto is so ready to go, we should at least have a general idea of what supplies to bring. Who knows how long this retrieval mission could go on for? Shino spoke up as he calmed a sensitive female destruction bug. You're right, Shino. I should get Akamaru ready for the trip. It's been a while since he's been on a real tracking mission. We're probably a bit rusty, Kiba replied with as he stood from the floor. This new era of relative peace has made us all a bit rusty. If anything, we get to test out our abilities again on a traveling mission. Neji said as he, too, stood from the floor. I'll be glad to let some of my destruction bugs out for a flight. They could scout over a large proximity, and the females can be tracked by the males if they find anything. This will be good for us, Shino said before downing his glass of water. I'll be readying my weapons and packing. Make sure you plan ahead, Kiba. Neji reprimanded the Inuzuka heir with a knowing smile. Kiba huffed in annoyance. 4. Yay. Yay. Eat it, Neji. Kiba growled out at his friend's comment before heading towards the front door. All in good fun, you know that. I'll see you guys when we're ready to leave. I'm sure we'll be meeting Shikamaru in Suna when we receive his response. Neji said as he followed Kiba and Shino to the door. Most likely. Of course, it all depends on if that lazy Nara replies to the letter. Kiba laughed as he thought of their friend. I hear Tamari has him on a pretty good leash. He'll reply in no time. Gaara is, after all, the cage, and I'm sure he'll see the letter before Shikamaru does. Shino joked as he made his way out into the street. Well, we should head out. See you when we're ready. Kiba said as he made his way down the street towards the main road. Neji gave an affirmative nod of his head before going back inside his house, and straight up to his room. There, he pulled out his old travel bag and weapons pouch, and got to work sharpening the old blades. Peace or not, he wanted to be prepared for whatever, or whomever, was out there beyond the village walls. He hoped that he wouldn't need to use any of his weapons for a retrieval mission, but he didn't let the thought free of his mind. Naruto walked through the front door and made his way to his room, where he pulled a scroll from his desk and a pen from the drawer. He knew what he wanted to say, and what he wanted to convey, but the letter he'd seen on Tsunade's desk a few days ago made him a bit hesitant to ask Shikamaru to travel with them. He took a deep breath and began writing. Hey Shikamaru. It's been a long time man, how've you been? Ba-chan is horrible about leaving letters out on her desk, and I saw the most recent one from Gaara. Congratulations to you and Tamari. It's about time you guys moved up in your relationship. You guys will make a great family, I can tell. Speaking of family, I have a request to make of you. My mom didn't die after the Nine Tails attack. She disappeared from the village, and no one knows where she went. Retrieval teams have tried to find her before, but no one has been able to track her. Kiba and Shino have agreed to be part of my team, and they were on their way to talk with Neji when I left Kiba's house. I'm sure he'll agree to be a part of a retrieval team again, and he's probably itching to get out of the village as much as the rest of us. So, my favor that I need to ask of you, is will you be a part of the team? Even if it means that you do reconnaissance in Suna for me, it would mean the absolute world to have you as a member of the team. I wouldn't want to take you out of the village with Tamari currently pregnant, but I would like to have your help with this mission. Give me a response when you can, no matter what it may be. Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto rolled the scroll and sealed it. He pocketed the scroll and made his way back out of the house, turning once more to head back to the Hokage mansion. Making his way up the stairs to the aviary, he looked between the group of falcons before finding the one that predominantly flew between Konoha and Suna, taking note of the Sand Village symbol on the scroll carrier attached to the falcon's leg. He approached the falcon, mindful of the possibility of startling it, and reached out to touch its wing. The falcon looked at him, but otherwise didn't move, and Naruto took the opportunity to slide the scroll into the carrier on the falcon's leg. Seeing Naruto seal the carrier, the falcon stretched its wings before making its way to the open window and flying off. Naruto watched it for a few minutes before it disappeared on the horizon, and he smiled as he made his way down the steps and back out onto the street. Tsunade stood up from her office chair and stretched the stiffness from her lower back, hoping to get the blood to flow through her sore muscles again. When she felt that the stiffness was mostly gone, she looked at the stack of completed papers, then made her way out into the hallway, down the stairs, and out to the street. She walked down the street to the local dango restaurant and made her way inside, having not eaten since she left for the mansion that morning. Making her way inside, she noticed Kurenai sitting alone at a table with a mournful look on her face. Tsunade was confused by the expression, and began to make her way over to Kurenai to question the other woman's unusual shift in mood. As she got closer, she made her presence known as she spoke. Kurenai, what are you doing here alone? Tsunade asked as she sat across from the younger Kunoichi. Oh, Tsunade-sama, I didn't notice you come in. Kurenai replied with a start, having been drawn from her thoughts when Tsunade first spoke. As Tsunade shifted to make herself more comfortable, she eyed Kurenai curiously, taking note of her puffy eyes. She had been crying not long before Tsunade had gotten there, if the dried tear tracks were any indication. Of course, She may not have bothered to wipe them away after she had cried herself out, and she looked positively exhausted. Tsunade looked at her with a questioning glance, but Kurenai didn't even ask her why. Tsunade sighed as she rested her elbows on the table, and her chin on the backs of her hands. Kurenai, have you slept at all lately? Tsunade asked with a concerned facial expression. To be honest, no, not really. Kurenai sighed as she folded her hands on the table. You look absolutely beat. What happened? Tsunade asked as she reached out and placed one of her hands on Kurenai's. I don't think that this is the best place to discuss personal matters. Would you like to come to the mansion? Or to my office at the hospital? Either would work. I'm just not entirely comfortable talking about it in such a public place. A waitress approached them with menus, handing them over to the two women while telling them about the specials that the restaurant was offering that day. Tsunade listened to the young woman, no more than 17, rattle off their 2-for-1 special, their drink special, and their chef's special. Tsunade asked if they could have a few minutes to look over the menu, but asked if they could get some waters. The waitress nodded and left, brought them their waters, and made her way around the restaurant while they looked over their menus. Tsunade had glanced at the menu briefly before turning her gaze over the top to look at Kurenai. She hadn't even bothered to open her menu, let alone look at it. She hadn't even acknowledged the glass of water to her right. Tsunade sighed as she looked at the younger woman in front of her. She placed her menu down with all intent to talk to Kurenai, but the waitress came back to ask if they were ready. Kurenai, without missing a beat, asked for an order of teriyaki dango, while Tsunade asked for a sweet dango. The waitress left with a smile and Tsunade turned her attention back to Kurenai, who had just moved her water to her left. Kurenai, I'm not gonna push you, but are you sure you're okay? Tsunade asked before taking a sip of her water. I'm fine, Tsunade-sama. Really. I've just been feeling overly exhausted for the past couple weeks, and I'm not sure why. Kurenai replied as she watched the ice cubes float around in her glass. A part of Tsunade flipped into medic mode, and she looked Kurenai over again. Any changes in mood or appetite? Tsunade asked as she looked at Kurenai's exposed skin, which seemed to be paler than usual. Weird cravings every once in a while, but nothing over the top, just being hungry at weird hours of the night. And just the exhaustion. I don't feel huge waves of mood swings, if that's what you're asking. Kurenai said as she grabbed her glass for a drink. Have you considered that you may be pregnant? Tsunade asked as she went over Kurenai's answer, as well as taking in her further lack of pigmentation in her skin. It was a thought. Are you sure? Do you think I am? Kurenai was now looking at Tsunade, eyes boring into the elder woman. It is a distinct possibility. How long has this been going on? I'm not sure. Probably a month. Maybe 2. Kurenai said, clearly not exactly sure about when she had first started to feel fatigued. Why don't we go to the hospital after lunch? I'd like to do an examination. Tsunade said as she looked at Kurenai, who was not fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. Tsunade was just about to discuss more with Kurenai, but the waitress came back with their dango, making sure that they were set and didn't need anything else, before heading off and coming back with a water refill. When she left again, the two women began to eat in relative silence. They spoke occasionally between bites, but wanted to keep the conversation between themselves, seeing as how there were a few people who were watching them as they spoke. Tsunade wasn't all that surprised by the confused glances. She was the Hokage, and she rarely came down without at least 2 Anbu guard with her. To see her just sitting casually with another shinobi was practically unheard of. But Tsunade knew better. Her Anbu guard were standing on top of the 2 buildings that stood at either side of the restaurant, carefully watching every person who walked in and out of the building. Both of her guard were members of the Hyuga clan. The 2 of them finished their meals and began to converse again. Kurenai, why don't we head over to the hospital? I have to check a few of the more critical patients anyways, and it will give me a chance to give you a proper examination and answer. Tsunade said as she looked over at Kurenai. Yes. The sooner we can do the examination, the sooner I'll know. Kurenai replied as she stood from her chair. Tsunade stood from her chair, paid, and made their way out of the restaurant. Many of the civilians watched as the two of them left, mostly in awe of the fact that the Hokage had just been sitting there having lunch. Some were smitten by the two women as they walked by, and some of the kids that were there thought it was the greatest thing in the world to have their village's leader having lunch so close to them. Tsunade led the way as the two of them walked through the streets towards the hospital, receiving greetings from everyone walking in the street, and having many of the older civilians thanking them for protecting them in times of crisis. The two women would smile and nod a greeting back, but continued on towards the hospital, through the doors, and back towards Tsunade's office. As Tsunade opened her office door, she sighed at the amount of paperwork that cluttered her desk, and made her way over. Taking a seat at the desk, she sifted through the stack, signed off on release forms and critical cases, and filed away any forms that didn't need her approval or signature. After the paperwork was taken care of, Tsunade waved Kurenai over and had her sit in the chair across from the desk. Kurenai did as she was asked, and once she was comfortable, Tsunade began to ask her various questions about the last 2 months. All right, let's begin, shall we? When was the last time you were menstruating? Tsunade asked as she looked over at Kurenai, pen hovering over a blank sheet of paper. I know I'm late, and I think my last cycle was about a month and a half ago. Kurenai guessed as she thought of the calendar that hung up in her bedroom. All right, and cravings weren't anything out of the ordinary. Just strange times where you were hungry. Tsunade asked for confirmation, relaying the question that she had originally asked at the restaurant. Yes, nothing strange. A higher drive for sweets and spice, but no strange combinations of foods. Kurenai replied. Tsunade briefly thought of her own cravings, and remembered some of the weirder ones that she'd actually eaten in her first trimester. Her nose wrinkled at the thought. Any heartburn at all? Tsunade continued as she wrote down Kurenai's previous answers. Occasionally, but it's not too bad. It only lasts for a few minutes, and then it's gone. Kurenai replied as she stretched her legs out. Tsunade finished writing down Kurenai's responses to some of the basic questions, put her pen down, and began to rub her temples. If Kurenai was indeed pregnant, her symptoms were clearly very minimal, and Tsunade even questioned if the woman was pregnant or not, but finally decided that the only way to actually find out was to get some of the lab equipment brought in. Well, whatever symptoms you have are clearly very minimal. Even some of my earliest patient pregnancies are already at the stage of craving strange foods, or are having morning sickness, but you've had none of that. What I'd like to do is an ultrasound. I just want to be completely sure before I rule anything out. Tsunade clarified as she looked at the younger woman before her. I'm up for anything at this point. Whatever you need to do, I'll do it. Kurenai replied as she stood and followed Tsunade out of her office. The two women made their way down the hall towards an empty room in the back of the hospital, and Tsunade pointed to the bed in the middle of it. Kurenai walked up to the bed and took a seat on the edge, arms resting at her sides. Tsunade made her way over to the bed with a machine rolling at her side. Kurenai thought it looked like a small TV, but then she noticed the small wand attached to it. Tsunade brought a small bottle of blue liquid up from a shelf on the cart, then turned the monitor on. Kurenai lifted her shirt up to just below her chest, and Tsunade applied a small glob of the warm liquid to her abdomen. She moved the wand around for a bit, applying light pressure as she did so, until she came to rest just above her navel. Well, would you look at that? Tsunade said as she looked at the screen. What is it? What do you see? Kurenai asked as she shifted to see the screen herself. Tsunade pulled it around so that Kurenai could look, and pointed to a small white spot on the screen. See that? Tsunade asked as she pointed the spot out. Is that a baby? Kurenai asked as she looked at the image. She was transfixed by it, and tears began to well up in her eyes. It is. That's your baby, Kurenai. Tsunade replied with a smile as she looked over to the younger woman. See that pulsing on the screen? I do. Is that a heartbeat? It is a heartbeat. Too early for limb development still, but we definitely have a heartbeat. Tsunade said with a smile as she looked over to Kurenai. Kurenai was silent as she looked up at the screen next to her. Tsunade had captured an image and went to print it out for Kurenai. A humming sound followed, and a small picture slipped out of a printer that sat below the screen. Tsunade grabbed the picture and circled the white spot with a pen before handing it to Kurenai. The younger Kunoichi held the picture in a firm grip with trembling hands, tears welling up in her eyes. She pulled her shirt back down over her abdomen, never taking her eyes off of the picture, and slowly stood up from the bed. Tsunade watched as Kurenai stared at the picture in her hand, and could see a look of sadness pass through her eyes. Tsunade's eyebrows furrowed as she looked at the young woman before her. She then thought it would help Kurenai if Tsunade connected with her. Kurenai, you're not the only one in this situation, Tsunade said as she stood from the chair she was sitting in. Kurenai finally took her eyes from the picture and looked over at Tsunade with surprise. What do you mean? She asked, never once thinking that the woman before her could be pregnant. Tsunade chuckled before pulling her jacket back and turning to her side. Kurenai was shocked to see the small bump that had developed on the elder woman, thinking that maybe she had just gained a little weight. Now, she could see clear as day that Tsunade was, indeed, pregnant. She couldn't contain the joy that she felt at the sight of Tsunade's baby bump, and a smile spread across her face. I didn't know, she exclaimed as she continued to look at the bump. Not many people do. Sakura, Shizune and Naruto are the only 3 people who really knew. My Anbu guards know as well, but that's by necessity. Tsunade explained as she let her jacket fall back to her sides. I must have looked so foolish just standing there and crying. Kurenai said as she hung her head a bit. Don't apologize for your feelings. This is new for you, and it means a new life as well. I'm taking you off of the active duty roster when I get back to the mansion. Tsunade said as the 2 of them walked down the hallway towards the entrance of the hospital. Thank you for this. It means more than words can express. Kurenai said with a bow as she left the hospital. Tsunade watched her disappear against the city background, and sighed to herself as she walked out of the hospital and towards the Hokage mountain. She had taken to sitting at the top of the mountain lately, and with the change in the weather from what it had been that morning, she figured she would take advantage of the mild evening. The walk took a bit out of her, and her feet were killing her by the time she came to the top of the mountain, so she took a seat on the first rock that she could find with a relatively flat top. When she couldn't find one that was naturally worn away at the top, she made one by punching it in half. She relaxed on the boulder, watching the sky go from a deep orange to a hazy purple, and sighed in content of the perfect night. However, her serene thoughts were cut short when she picked up on another chakra signature making its way towards her. She pulled a kunai from the small pouch she had sewn to the inside of her jacket and faced the woods behind her, ready to throw the weapon at her impending visitor. Naruto walked out towards the top of the mountain, like usual, and didn't even notice the chakra signature that was already present at his normal quiet place. He walked out of the woods, but stopped instantly when a kunai flew next to his head. He quickly snapped out of his daze and jumped back, his own kunai drawn as he looked around the area for his attacker, only to see Tsunade standing a few yards away from him with another kunai drawn. As realization struck both of them, their weapons returned to the pouches, and Naruto put on his best puppy dog eyes as he made his way over to Tsunade. Ba-chan, what was that for? Naruto asked as he looked at her. Naruto, I'm so sorry. I didn't even realize it was you. Tsunade apologized as she looked at the young blonde before her. Well, guess neither of us knew the other was here. I guess I can forgive you. Naruto joked as he now stood before her. Well, thank goodness. I thought I would need to ask Kakashi to be my personal guard with you mad at me. Tsunade replied sarcastically, grinning wickedly at the hurt look that Naruto gave her in response. I wasn't being serious, Ba-chan. Naruto said happily as he embraced her into a mother-son hug. You're just too cute sometimes. Tsunade said as she ruffled Naruto's hair. Naruto laughed and Tsunade could tell that he was just so much like his father. The same laugh, the same hair, and ultimately the same eyes and personality. Each of them were just like Jiraiya, Minato's godfather. Tsunade, herself, was Minato's godmother, so she was always protective of him after his parents passed away in a joint mission in Rock Country. Now she felt as if their responsibility to Minato had been passed on to his and Kushina's only son, and she would be damned if she would let anything happen to the young man who was holding onto her right now. She felt something dampen on her shirt, and she looked down to Naruto's shaking frame. She quickly wrapped her arms around the younger blonde and lowered to the ground with him, holding him close to her like she had once done to his father. Naruto was clinging to her, small sobs escaping his throat, and she would be damned if she let him go. She gently stroked his hair and rocked him back and forth, trying to soothe him of his discomfort. Ba-chan, you won't leave me, will you? Naruto asked into her shirt, trying to stop the tears that kept falling down his cheeks. No, I'll never leave you, Naru-kun. Tsunade reassured as she continued to stroke his hair. Good, Naruto said as he released the intense grip on Tsunade, but kept his arms loosely around her waist. I'll never leave you as long as I live. Tsunade reassured again as she placed a soft kiss on the top of his head. He nuzzled in closer to her, a smile on his face, and she just held him closer. She was so close to Naruto in relation, both with her own relation to the Uzumaki clan, and in regards to having been Minato's godmother. She had assumed that Jiraiya had never gotten the chance to tell Naruto much about his father, and by extent Tsunade and himself, but she would take it upon herself to tell the boy everything he wanted to know, without him needing to ask. She looked down at the boy and spoke. Naruto, did Jiraiya ever tell you anything about your father? Tsunade asked, her head still resting on top of his head. No, he only told me that Dad was the one who created the Rasengan and the Flying Thunder God technique. Naruto said as he rested his head against Tsunade's side. Then he left out some very important information. Your father wasn't just one of the best shinobi that this village ever had, or the creator of two powerful jutsus. Tsunade replied with a small smile. She could feel Jiraiya's chakra signature coming towards them from the woods. Really? What else was there about him? Naruto asked, no immersed in Tsunade's words. Well, your grandparents were great shinobi as well, on both sides of your family. Your mother's village was destroyed during the war, and the villagers who survived dispersed to other countries seeking refuge. We have a few whirlpool villagers that live here, but many scattered, afraid to live so close to their old village. When your mother came to the village, we were told, as shinobi, that she had been sent to avoid the war that would eventually destroy her home. And your father, he was everything that I had ever wanted in a child. Calm and talented, he was ranked in the top 5 of his class at the academy. He was the child I had dreamed of having. Tsunade spoke softly as she told Naruto of his parents. It's true, kid. Minato was a dream to have around. He picked up everything, learned as he trained, and begged for more training even when he was at his limit. Being his godparents brought Tsunade and I closer together. Jiraiya said as he came out of the wood and stood behind Tsunade. Jiraiya, you're ruining our moment. Tsunade reprimanded as she turned her focus back to Naruto. Anyways, Naruto, a few years later when your father was a genin, Jiraiya and I were brought out of being just his godparents. We took him in as our own son. You see, Naruto, your paternal grandparents died on a joint mission in Rock Country when your father had just become a genin, and we knew that it was our duty to take him in as our own son. Jiraiya said as he put his arm over Tsunade's shoulder as he noticed the tears that were silently falling down her pale cheeks. I didn't know any of that. That must have been really hard on all of you, Naruto said sadly as he looked down to the ground. That's why I was so concerned when you asked me if you could go and find your mother. I didn't want you to be disappointed if you had found out that she had passed. Tsunade said as she wrapped her arms around his shoulders. We care for you just as we cared for your father, and we don't want to ever see you hurt, physically or emotionally. Naruto, Tsunade and I would do anything to protect you, even sacrifice ourselves to do it, because we've taken you on as our own son, thick-headed and, at times, a pain in the. Jiraiya said with a smile, getting a light chuckle out of Tsunade through her tears. Thanks guys. I'm glad that I have both of you. Naruto said as he hugged both Tsunade and Jiraiya. Ero Sennin, think you could point me in the direction of the last place Mom was seen? Naruto asked as he looked over to his godfather. Well, let's see. If she were to have went closer to home, she could be in the Mist Village, or the Land of Waves. If she went the other way, it's quite possible that she's been hiding out in Suna or Iwa. My best guess is that she went closer to home. I would start in Wave. Jiraiya spoke as he rubbed his chin in thought. Naruto, I trust that you'll find her safe and in one piece. Your mother was a very special woman, and you resemble her in so many ways, but at the same time, you also resemble your father. I want you to find your mother, and I want you to bring her home safely. Tsunade said as she embraced Naruto in a tight hug. I'll get the team together as soon as Shikamaru comes in from Suna. They're probably already prepared to go. Naruto said with a smile as he looked between his godparents. I'll have the mission report ready before he comes to town, which shouldn't be long, judging by the letter I got back from Gaara today. Tsunade replied as she looked between the two men that were in her life. Those falcons fly fast. Damn. Naruto said as he recalled having just sent his letter this morning. I'm sure Gaara helped with that. How else would the falcon have come back so quickly? Tsunade laughed as she ruffled Naruto's hair again. Well, I should get home and pack some things, and make sure that my weapons are sharpened and accounted for. I'll see you guys later. Naruto said as he stood from the ground, hugged them each once more, and made his way towards the forest. Jiraiya helped Tsunade up from the ground, extended his arm out to her, and walked with her back to the Hokage mansion. Since she was pregnant later in life, she had started to develop some complications, and was struggling a bit, so Jiraiya had offered to help in any way that he could. Naruto was just about to disappear into the forest when he looked back and saw his godparents share a quick kiss. He smiled, remembering that they had just come together as a couple, in public, that afternoon. They had started becoming a couple as Tsunade finished her first trimester, and have only grown their relationship since. But Tsunade still had not told anyone who fathered the baby. Maybe she'll say something tonight. Ba-chan isn't great at keeping secrets. Naruto thought as he disappeared into the night. Tsunade and Jiraiya slowly made their way up the stairs to the mansion, but only because Tsunade had promised Naruto that she would get the paperwork for his escapade signed for him so he could go as soon as the team was fully assembled. Sitting at her desk, Tsunade opened a drawer, wrote up a mission that was B-ranked, and gave her stamp of approval on it before putting it back into the one drawer that she never used for anything. Inside that drawer was a stuffed wolf with 10 tails and a small frog that resembled Gamabunta, Jiraiya's toad summon. After putting the statement away, she stood up from her desk and walked over to where Jiraiya was standing by the door, fondly looking at the pictures of the previous 4 Hokages. Are you staying at one of the inns? Tsunade asked as she came to stand next to Jiraiya. No, I was actually just passing through to see you and Naruto. I was planning to go to Mist next. He replied as he looked over to her from the picture of Minato. Well, you can stay with Shizune and I at my grandfather's old home. There's some extra rooms in there. Tsunade said as she rested against the wall on the opposite side of the door. If you're offering, I guess I can't really refuse, can I? Jiraiya laughed as he moved over to the door and opened it, allowing Tsunade to walk out to the hallway. You're right, but the invitation isn't to my bed. Tsunade smirked as she looked over her shoulder at Jiraiya, who was now pouting at such a harsh rejection. Do you have to be so cruel? Only to you, and you know you like it. Kakashi rolled over in his bed, and laced his arm over Anko's waist, pulling her body closer to his. He smiled under his mask as he held her close to him after their night of fun, as Anko had put it. He felt her pull his mask down, and she looked at him with hungry eyes, making him smile wider. She went down on his lips, and soon she wound up laying on him again, never wanting to release him from her kiss except for when they each needed air to breathe. They pulled apart after several minutes, and Anko slid down next to Kakashi once again. "I love you," Anko whispered as she started to doze off again. "I know," Kakashi replied as he, too, began to drift back off to sleep. The two of them remained tangled together as they drifted back off into their dreams. When morning found them, still in the same position, they thought nothing of it as they untangled themselves and got dressed for the day. Anko had a meeting with Ibiki that morning about some new interrogation program that he wanted to implement, and Kakashi had promised Naruto that they would train together for a few hours to get him ready for his upcoming retrieval mission. The two of them parted ways after Kakashi realized he would be late regardless. When questioned about his tardiness, he merely replied that he was lost on the path of life. Naruto called his bluff, and the two of them sparred for the next few hours.